with the 7 board members in the room, I am going to start today's work session. The first one is impact of mobility on student achievement, scheduled until 12:30. I understand that Dr. Duran, along with 4 principals, are joining him with Dr. Presidio as well. I need about 25 to 30 minutes for presentation, and then we'll go into a Q&A and discussion afterwards, unless you have a really very short clarifying questions. Just to hold on to your questions until presentation is done with the first. I am missing my co-manager today, as you know, so if I somehow miss you seeing you raising your hand, please forgive me.
I think people know why. Can you explain why?
Oh, my co-manager's flight from West Coast got bumped. So she's not arriving until it is too late to join us. So with that, Dr. Duran.
All right, good morning, board members. First of all, I'd like to introduce my colleagues here with me at the table, Dr. Presidio from Instructional Services, and I'm really pleased to have 4 principals here to share their voices from the field and their they were teasing me about why I say voices from the field. Margaret said, I thought it has tones of military, but no, voices from the schools. Okay, so they're here to provide their thoughts on the impact. If you recall, the focus of today, coming out of a school board forum, was really what is the impact that mobility has on our schools, specifically accreditation and our graduation outcomes. So we have Margaret Barnes here, Lisa Pilsen, Tim Thomas, and Jesse Kraft, who you'll be hearing from shortly. Also, I'd like to thank many of the folks in the back of the room who helped put this together. And so we have Michelle Van Dyke and all of the folks that supported her in the Office of Instructional Technology, our division-wide data collaboration team led by Beatrice Huffman, as well as many, many members of our instructional services and also special services teams who helped with this presentation. So I want to thank them, and certainly they're here if we do need additional questions. So our time today will be focused on 3 key points, followed by, again, time for your questions and your thoughts. We want you to make sure that you better understand the impact that mobility is having, but also before we do that, we need to understand how is mobility defined in FCPS. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how we define it, and then talk to the impact with regards to accreditation measures, and then with regards to our student achievement, and then hear from our principals. So let's start looking a little closer at how we define mobility here in FCPS. So in FCPS, we recognize that mobility is a factor that certainly influences the work that our schools do. As such, we've developed a methodology to calculate mobility. That methodology was actually developed in the 1980s, so it's been used for quite some time. And we've made minimal changes to the formula since then. This calculation on mobility shows us comparisons across schools and across time. Essentially, mobility, as defined in FCPS, is a way to represent all of the movement in and out of a school during an academic year. So what that means is that every enrollment after the first official student day count, and then withdrawals and entries up to the very last day of that school year, regardless of the reason. The tally of the ins and outs that occurs during the school year is then divided by the number of unique students who've attended that school over the course of that year. And that is how we come up with our mobility data. For example, let's say you start a school with 1,000 students at the beginning of the school year. During that year, let's say 100 students withdraw and leave the school, taking the school's membership down to 900. However, 100 new students enroll at the school in the year, bringing it back up to 1,000. When you would calculate mobility, we would start by taking the 100 withdrawals plus the 100 new enrollments for a total of 200 changes during the school year. Then we would take the 1,000 original students plus the 100 new ones who entered mid-year to find a total of 1,100 as the year of the overall enrollment of that year. So 200 membership changes divided by the 1,100 would result in a mobility rate of 18%. That's very complicated, but it basically shows how we're taking the ins, the outs, looking at what the total number is, and dividing it to come up with what percentage we would see in terms of mobility. What's also important to note is that VDOE does not require or have a definition for mobility expected by all divisions. So you might look at mobility data points from across the Commonwealth on other school districts' web pages and see how it's defined differently than we define it. And so it's not possible for us to compare how our mobility rate is to the state and or to other divisions, since it is not done and calculated the same way. Let's take a little closer look at our mobility rate as I just defined it. In the past 5 years, overall, our division has ranged from 12% to 13%. And as we look a little closer, there are some breakdowns of what that really looks like. The majority of our movement was within FCPS or within Virginia, which you can see includes students exiting and returning to the same school during the year. You might think, well, actually the 45 looks higher than the 30, but I'm going to explain that in a moment. So the majority you'll see within FCPS or within Virginia, 30%. Under 10% resulted from dropouts and withdrawals due to 15 days of absence. It is important to note that the outside Virginia description, which is the 45%, is kind of a little bit of a misnomer because it includes all the students coded in SIS as no prior Virginia or no prior U.S. public school. However, in reality, this designation is given only to students who are transferring from outside the U.S., but also to students starting pre-K kindergarten late in the year, as well as other students who start late in the year. So it's not just coming from without, it might be someone within who's starting late in the year. So in reality, the 45% figure provided breaks down into these two ways. And then I'll 35, yes, oh, okay. I was too fast? All right. Trying to go quickly so our principals can have more of the time. So the 45% of coming from outside Virginia, that would seem to be on the surface that everyone's coming from another state or another country. That's not actually completely true, because what it is also defining is 35% of those students to or from elsewhere in the U.S. That's what we would normally think of that 45%. But 10% of that 45% is actually late arrivals for the school year who may or may not have already been in an FCPS school or in another Virginia school. So you have to separate that. It's a little bit of a misnomer. It's not all 45 coming from Virginia or Maryland or another country. 35% of it is, 10% of it is late arrivals within the school. Though we don't formally track the reason behind transfers within the student information system, and there's a lot of reasons why in terms of privacy and being able to ask individuals why they're moving. There are a couple of times we're required to ask that, and certainly there's times when it's a special service placement where we would know that because we've done that. But in blanket sense, we cannot and do not require a reason why you're moving in or out. But here's a couple of broad range of some of those reasons that you'll see on the screen. I won't read all of them to you, but obviously one of them that stands out for us is military. We know we have a large military population, so we see a lot of those families moving in and out of our system. And then we also can see that we do have a lot of other family reasons, and that's one for job transfers, new homes. Those are ones that we know anecdotally, and principals certainly know that often when a parent may be moving from home to home, but it's not something that we track. But in regards to the student placement piece for special services, we definitely would know those because we're a part of when we might make those assignments. And keep in mind that that particular point of special service placement would only be for changes from the first day of school to the last day. So if there's any placements that happen from special services over the summer, that would not be included in that count. This pink map here, this map here shows the distribution of mobility within the county. The pink dots represent schools at 20% or higher. The pale blue represents schools with under 10% mobility. As you might have anticipated, you can see that our distribution of mobility roughly aligns to the economic health of our communities, and it mirrors a lot of other maps we see where we see concentrations of high mobility in certain parts of the county. We also have highlighted for you the top 10 elementary and top 10 secondary schools, but there is an attachment that lists every single school in FCPS, what their mobility rate is, what their accreditation pass rates are, and if they're a high school, their GCI, as well as their poverty rate. So this attachment is on board docs for you to see all of our schools. But here we've simply listed the top 10 of our mobile elementary schools in FCPS last year. Actually, all of our top 10 are elementary schools. We did identify on the next slide some high mobile secondary schools, but all of our high schools of mobility are elementary. Schools with asterisks on here have been consistently in the top 10 list for 2 or more of the past 3 years. And 2 of our principals that are with us today are on that list, and you'll be hearing from them. This next list shows, again, the top-ranked mobile middle and high schools from last year. But again, you'll see on the chart that our secondary schools are very far down the list with a lot of other elementary schools in there, because our elementary schools tend to be where we see that mobility rate much higher. 2 principals, Tim Thomas and Margaret, who are here from that list. You will hear from them shortly as well. So now that we have a little bit of an idea of what mobility is and how it looks in our division, again, how we define it, which is not defined the same way across Virginia, we want to consider what is the impact of mobility, not just simply what does it look like on the map, not just what our school's mobility rates, that's important to know, but what types of impact do we see happening on our accreditation and on our student achievement. So we're going to take a quick look at each of these 5 areas currently considered by the state for determining accreditation and then for GCI. And then that will be followed up with more of a meaningful conversation from our principals, who you can hear directly from how it impacts them and some of the things they're doing to address mobility. So this first graph plots each school's English accreditation pass rates from 2016 to 2017 against its mobility rate. So you'll see on the left column the accreditation pass rate, in this case for English, and on the bottom you'll see the mobility rate from 0 up to 35%. For example, the top teal dot in this cluster at the far right represents Coates Elementary, and Mr. Kraft is here to talk to us about his school in a moment. In this example, Coates had an 86% English pass rate shown on the vertical axis, and then if you look at the bottom on the horizontal axis, a 33% mobility rate. The teal dots indicate schools from the top 10 elementary schools. The orange dots would be the top 10 middle and high schools. So while the downward sloping trend line indicates a tendency for overall lower English performance at schools, mobility rates increases, we can also see that this correlation is fairly loose, represented by the spread of dots that are on either side of the trend line. So that is a snapshot of our English outcomes. For math, on the next slide, we see a very similar overall trend as we did in English. And again, the yellow are the top 10, or the orange are the top 10 middle and high, and the blue are our top elementary schools. Again, for history, we see somewhat similar, but we see a little bit more of a concentration up on the top. And for science, while the trend line is more severe in the downward slope for science, the spread is even more significant. For all of these 4 academic areas, the spread suggests that mobility in itself cannot be attributed as the sole cause for performance shifts, but certainly a cause. So I'm going to say that again. What we're seeing here from our mobility data points on these charts is that it's certainly a factor, but it cannot be attributed as the sole factor for some of these performance shifts. When we hear from our principals in a moment, we will again gain a fuller picture of the connections between the challenges Because certainly, while it's not the only issue, it is a major issue that presents challenges. So we want to hear from our principals how they address those challenges. Dr. Presidio is at the table to answer questions on what we're doing at the division level to make sure that we have consistency around our instructional resources, around our expectations, and what we provide to schools, so that as students are being mobile around the division, they'll be able to receive those same supports regardless of the school that they attend. Finally, looking at our high school's GCI outcomes, we find a very similar trend with high mobility schools facing greater challenges in ensuring on-time graduation for their students. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot of what our mobility data looks like, how its impact is showing in terms of our accreditation pass rates and our GCI outcomes, as well as the fact that we really need to think and understand what mobility is defined in FCPS and what does that really mean for us. So at this time, I want to turn the session over to some of our principals who are going to share with us their challenges, how they have addressed those challenges, and their successes, and what they do to provide supports and put supports in place for their students and their staff. So first, we're going to turn to Lisa Pilson and Margaret Barnes, who are going to share their perspectives from Holmes and from Annandale Terrace. And so we'll start with Margaret from Holmes Middle School.
Thank you. Good morning. So I got some numbers from my registrar today, and I was very happy to be included in this because when Dr. Duran called me, it was kind of like an aha to know that we're in the top 10 because we feel it, but to actually know that we're in that top 10 was like a confirmation for us. So I learned from my registrar this morning that since the first day of school, we've had 43 students who have left Holmes and 62 who have entered Holmes, and they run the gamut of the reasons that Dr. Duran mentioned, like IEP placement, students who are new to the country, students who are re-entering the school after being absent for 15 consecutive days. Also, I don't think it's an accident that 3 of the schools who are here are in the Annandale Pyramid. With our proximity to Alexandria City, we sort of trade students with Hammond Middle School, with PG County, DC, close to Prince William, so we have a lot of that mobility there. So a couple of the things that I'll mention today are the impact on interventions and instruction and on our ESOL staffing has been significant. So because of the mobility that we saw within our ESOL population last year, we actually planned for growth within our staffing, but then that's kind of a gamble because every year that mobility might be different. Because last year, for example, we had 1 beginning ESOL class at each grade level, but by the end of the year, that class was up to 20 or 25, which for an ESOL teacher with beginning students can be extremely challenging trying to meet all of those different needs. So this year, we designed our staffing so that we would have 2 sections at each grade level, and we're already hitting the limits for what we planned for. So that's, again, it's kind of a gamble, and we have to make a trade in other places about how we support students, but that's one impact, is just planning for that staffing. The other one is how to quickly intervene when we see concerns. So we have to have a well-coordinated, responsive instruction team. One of the things that's critical is that registration conference. We have excellent counselors who know how to ask the right questions of families, because a lot of times that mobility has to do with uncertainty in the home, uncertainty with employment. So we have counselors who are very skilled at asking the right questions and know when we need to provide more intensive interventions, possibly from our social worker or psychologist or from special services. One big challenge can be that we don't get many records from the previous school, or the way that an IEP or a 504, for example, looks in another school. How does that translate in Fairfax County where there are more services? Just anecdotally, one student that we received recently was at a school for students with high behavior needs in DC, but then had no IEP and that didn't translate at all when we got to when he got to Holmes. So within 3 months, because of how well coordinated our team is, within 3 months, he's gotten the support of special services, is in all team taught classes, but that's unheard of to identify a student that quickly, but that in order to provide him with the appropriate supports, we had to do that. I guess one final thing I would mention is just the instructional piece. If for Science 8, for example, where the content is 3 years, our Science 8 teachers, we have a student who comes mid-year or who was not in a Virginia school for 6th and 7th grade, they're covering those years of content as well to prepare students for the Science 8 SOL. And they're very strategic. Our Science 8 team showed gains last year. So it's just a lot to be taken into consideration in terms of instruction and intervention and how to respond to those student needs quickly in a timely manner.
Thank you. Lisa?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. To piggyback on the things that Margaret shared, we too have had significant gains. So since August 29th of this school year, we've had 72 gains in grades kindergarten through 5 and 34 losses. Very typical of our population, we have high ESOL, high poverty, and high mobility. That definitely has that's a contributor to a lot of struggles throughout the school day and throughout the school year. One of the things that I do want to touch on are the intervention pieces and trying to target those students right away and provide intervention supports for them. Our RI team works very hard in targeting these students and giving them support. One of the areas that we do run into a roadblock is ESOL, our English language proficiency of the students that we're getting. They, a lot of times, are newcomers to the country. They have, they come in at about a LEP level 1, so they're needing that transition support as far as that social piece, building the relationships, being a part of a classroom, and to add on to that, they're also needing that at that time to acquire the English language. We see a lot of trauma with our children. So the impact of the trauma piece, oftentimes we have a student that is with us right now that school this year, and this child is in 2nd grade. 6 schools this year, and it's a 2nd grader. And of course, he's bubbling up and he's on everybody's radar regarding the academic piece, but the social and emotional impact that all these changes have had and the uncertainty in the areas of this child's life that we cannot do anything about definitely play a factor into the school day. He may very well represent as a child with special education needs, but whenever you peel back the layers of that onion, this is a child that really he doesn't have stability outside of his school day. And his life is in turmoil. And he's not our only student that has these situations. We have lots of students that have these things going on where they might not change schools, but they're changing homes multiple times. We have many of our families that they are 2 and 3 families that are living in 1 3-bedroom apartment with 2 or 3 other families. So the exposure that our students are coming to school with, there's so many instances that we have to tend to as far as that's concerned. The unidentified special education needs. We have students who are transferring into, whether they're coming from another country, coming from another state, coming from another school in Virginia. If they have moved around a lot and they're going through the process of eligibility, there's so many things that are lost along the way. And these students, they're basically hitting a restart, staying. So it's not just the mobility in terms of students coming from other countries, other states. It's the students that are moving around and within Fairfax County Public Schools, and where they're needing supports. Teachers have found that they need some special education support, but we're having a hard time getting them settled, getting them properly tested and identified so an appropriate IEP can be created and those children can get the supports that they need. Although these are challenges, I have to significantly commend our teachers, because whenever you think about a classroom or a grade level, I would say our fourth grade has been the grade level this year that they've received the most students. So they've gained 16 students since the school years have started. The teachers are resilient. They build positive relationships with the students. Our ESOL teachers are responsive. We're fortunate enough to have a full-time social worker who targets those students. Our parent liaison is definitely just a godsend in the support that she provides to families and immediately connecting to them to get them the supports that they need. So despite the challenge, we have to really commend the teachers that endure this every day, because the classroom that they start the school year out with doesn't look the same at the end of the year. Many of those students, anywhere from 5 to 8 students that were not with them at the beginning of the year are with them at the end. So, thank you.
Thank you. And so as we heard from the two principals, you can see that as I started out saying something that saw some of your eyebrows go up when I said this, our mobility rate has been defined the same way since the 1980s. We haven't looked at it as deeply and as intentionally as we have recently, because it's not simply that we have students that are mobile that's the issue. It's that we're starting to see other needs that our students who are coming to us with. Even we've seen English language learners in this county for many years, but what's different? Now they're coming at level 1, level 2, and they're not coming proficient even in their primary language like they used to. So it's not just the fact that we have mobility as a concern, it's that there are a lot of other challenges that we need to address and that we're working towards. When we think about the social emotional needs of our families, certainly anyone who moves around a lot. I moved around a lot. I had two parents that were divorced since I was 1, and I went to schools all over the place. So I understand moving from school to school, what that does to you. But when you don't have the family support that I was fortunate to have, then it only gets worse and worse. I mean, I probably went to like 25, 26 schools in my K-12 experience. So I certainly understand being mobile. But I had a different type of family support system that we're not seeing always with our families that we're having to support now. So it's not just that you're mobile. It's not just looking at that data. It's digging a little deeper to understand what other concerns do we need to address? What other supports do we need to put in place? What is the population that we're serving now that looks different than when we started looking at this in the 1980s as tracking mobility? And you can hear from our principals, it's ELL, special ed, situations with parents coming in poverty, and again, not just ELL, but ELL students who don't speak their primary language. You don't even have a base in your primary language, and yet we're asking them to learn a second language, which is a different type of population that we're seeing more and more of. So now I want to shift to, see if I got the right slide, to our next two principals to talk a little bit about some of the successes and the strategies that they're putting in place. As I mentioned, Mr. Kraft from Coates Elementary, I highlighted him as an example, and if you remember on that one chart, his school was doing fairly well given the challenges that he faced with the mobility that he sees, which is one of the top in the division. So we'll start with Mr. Kraft from Coates.
Dr. Duran, before Mr. Kraft starts, I don't want anybody to think that either Annandale Terrace or Holmes Middle School has not been successful.
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
We heard some of their successes, and they're continuing, which is why we asked them to be here at the table.
All right. Good morning. I do want to talk a little bit about why I think certain things have been somewhat successful at Coates, but one challenge I would like to add on to what was said previously that is a big part of the mobility, at least in my school boundaries, is we lose a number of families because there are not single-family homes in our boundary at all. In the Coates boundary, there is, I believe, one home that would be considered a single-family home, and it is the furthest thing from a McMansion. So many times when a family is moving and we ask them why, it's because they finally are accomplishing their dream of buying a home. That home happens to be in Loudoun or somewhere else where we're close by, and there is no option to stay at Coates if that's your situation. So we have had some good data despite the challenge of having high mobility. Consulted with the staff to talk about why we think that is. And some of these things we can control, some of these things we have less control over. I would say I'm happy to be in this position to talk about successes, but I also think it's not a very stable position either, as the mobility challenge is so significant that you could bring me back in a year or two and my dot's not that high, but I want it to be. And here's how we think we keep it. One thing that has made a big difference for us is very tight instructional planning, and I'm talking daily lesson planning in reading and math and adhering to the FCPS curriculum. We need to have that tight planning to get to high academic success, but also if we're getting kids from other FCPS schools, our hope is that the other schools are teaching the curriculum as tightly as we are so that they can plug right in. If there is a breakdown, we don't want that to be on our end. But there is tight planning to the day in reading and math across all 7 grade level teams that everybody has unpacked the SOLs, has unpacked the pacing guide from instructional services, and we are teaching it, and we're teaching it on the same page as much as possible. The other factor that staff would agree with me on is we have adopted a very matter-of-fact attitude towards our situation. And we've made it very clear that the primary job of our school is to accomplish high academic performance from our kids. This seems obvious, but this took a lot of discussion in the last couple of years, because when you do have a number of kids who live in poverty, when you do have these mobility issues, when you do have a high prevalence of low-level LEP students, it can become very easy for the school to get too wrapped up in all of the other things we're doing to support kids and families' basic needs. And just like every school here, we do a lot of that stuff: clothing, food bags, counseling, all of those things, and we're not going to stop doing them. But unless it's stated very clearly and it becomes part of the culture, that can become a primary focus rather than a secondary focus. And we have become very unapologetic in saying we want to have business partners, we want to provide all the things I mentioned for kids and families, but we provide them so that we can leverage kids into higher academic performance, and that needs to be our stated primary purpose as a school. Another factor that the staff really thinks has made a big difference is the way that we use resource teachers, from reading specialists to ESOL teachers, just making sure that they are scheduled in as ambitious a way as we do with classroom teachers. And that sometimes requires some top-down scheduling for folks to make sure that we're maximizing these human resources as much as we possibly can. Another factor, I have 2 more. Another factor is staff stability. When you have less student stability, one thing that can help is to have better staff stability. So that's all about teacher retention, which would require a lot of unpacking as far as how we get there. But it is a priority for, I think, all of us anymore, but especially if you're in a school like ours. Another thing, and this should be obvious, but I feel like I need to say it anyway, needs-based staffing is incredibly beneficial for all of our schools. We are a Title I school. You saw our poverty rate on the slide. And having those extra resources, having the ability for class sizes to not be over 30, or some of the situations that some of my colleagues work through, I think has been very helpful to not only have a good, safe experience where kids feel included, but to actually get as much out of them academically as we possibly can. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Tim?
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I first want to commend the work of Ms. Pilson and Ms. Barnes for all they do to prepare the wonderful kids at Annandale High School. I think it'd be remiss if I didn't take advantage of this opportunity, and I'm sure I'd hear it at our next pyramid meeting as well. So,
No, we just want the jacket.
yeah, no, they're just looking for the spirit gear from Annandale, so I'm working on that. But, you know, we have to allocate our resources towards the kids, so I'll see what I can do on that. First, I thought I'd frame a little bit what Annandale High School looks like. 80% of our kids, our enrollment right now is about 2120. 80% of our students are either currently in an ESOL program or exited an ESOL program. And so I think that speaks volumes when we have this conversation around mobility. As you've heard, it's all tied into the demographics of our schools and the needs of our students. We have 74 countries represented at Annandale High School, including the United States. 35% of those kids are from the United States, 65% are from other countries. 55 languages spoken, English. This is what's reported as language spoken at home. 20% of our families report that English is the primary language spoken at home. 80% of our families report that a language other than English is spoken at home. So I think it's important to kind of keep some of those figures in mind as we have this conversation. And I appreciate having the conversation myself, having been at Westfield High School for 13 years, 9 as principal, and moving to Annandale High School and having almost completed 2.5 years there. There's a little bit of two different extremes, and so it's been a tremendous growth opportunity for me and incredibly rewarding work as well. I thought I'd start with an email that I was copied on this morning that started on Friday, and it's an email from one of our ESOL teachers to a number of other ESOL teachers, and it included the ESOL department chair, and it included our ESOL counselor on that email as well. She said, Asusena and Oscar G killed it on the WIDA writing today. That's a good thing. Asusena did everything correctly, and her writing was better than any level ones that I've seen so far. Yay. One teacher chimed in, woohoo. Our ESOL counselor, who we robbed from West Springfield High School with, who just works magic with our ESOL kids, especially our levels 1 and 2, she chimed in and said, that's terrific. Hopefully others are watching and can see that with a little effort, tons can be achieved. I'm emotional about how well many of our students are doing. Many will graduate on time. The program works when you care and do what you're supposed to do. Big shout out to our awesome ESOL teachers, and to Meredith, who's our department chair. So proud to be working with all of you. One of the other teachers chimed in this morning, and she happens to be one of our lead mentors also. She said, I wanted to share the great news of how our ESOL instruction, and this is when I was copied, so now she included the subject administrator for ESOL and myself. She said, I want to share the great news of how our ESOL instruction is coming along using the ESOL enhanced programming. In the second year of the program, the teachers at Annandale High School have come together even more on ways to prepare students for WIDA testing. It seems to be paying off. See the email from Kristen Lindstrom below about how our level 1 kids had confidence and showed their skills in writing. Also, our stupendous ESOL level 1 and 2 counselor, Evelyn Klumpkins, shared how she's seeing a boost in on-time graduation. It's just fantastic. This is also due to each of your work in building the curriculum for this new enhanced instruction. There was an article in the Loudoun local paper about newcomers, and I learned that they don't have the same system where students get high school credits for English 9 and 10. It makes me proud to be working in Fairfax. What a great story to share with, and it really, sure, round of applause. I saw someone down there was, yeah, absolutely. And listen, this I think is a perfect example and something that Lisa shared with me last Thursday at our all-county principals meeting, and she mentioned it. If you ask me to identify what's going well and why is it going well at Annandale, and I think we could all share success stories of our schools, it's Teachers 1A. Teachers 1A. And structure and programs 1B, or even 2. This was the email I read was just evidence of the links to which our teachers are going to work with kids in classrooms, and that's where there's no doubt we're going to get the most bang for the buck. I mean, at Annandale High School, everything is framed around our vision statement, which is respect, learning, relationships, diversity, value all, compromise none. But then we also have an instructional focus, which is also our belief or our mission, in that students must build their own understanding of content every day through reading, writing, thinking, and discussing. And finally, The how-to is the collaboration, the continuous improvement, the positive relationships, and our focus on a sustained focus on literacy. So it's absolutely the human capital behind what's the work that's getting done in the classroom, no doubt. Yes, the needs-based staffing is tremendous. The number of positions that we're able to create at Annandale High School, given those positions, including that ESOL counselor position that I just mentioned, and lowering class size in ESOL and English and math classes, for example, it is absolutely critical. I think one thing that I've been super proud of the last 2 years is our instructional focus, like I said, around reading, writing, thinking, and discussing, but also providing the professional development to back those up. So including, and the cultural proficiency modules, though everyone, there's a bit of a sigh when everyone has to go through the training. The feedback I've gotten from teachers, and the expertise that the folks who are putting on the presentations have displayed has really created, I think, another level of understanding of at least the kids at Annandale High School, and so for that I'm very appreciative. But a lot of our PD the last 2 years is also been tied into the specific needs of ESOL students, for example, which, let's face it, are a lot of the kids that are, which are why we're having this conversation today. I could go on and brag about Annandale High School and the things we're doing well. Know that there is a tremendous number of things that we need to do a lot better. And I think what I've been impressed with since day one at Annandale High School is that there are people there because they want to be there, and they understand the needs of the students, and they embrace not only the diversity, but they embrace the diversity and the needs of our kids. And I'm just, I'm super happy to be here today to be able to present some of that. I have a list of structures that we have in place, that I'm happy to provide if the opportunity is there later on. But it's to me, it's all about the human capital, and it's all about the investments we're making in our adults first, because that will undoubtedly pay dividends with our kids later on.
Thank you, Tim and Mr. Moon. Now we will open it up for questions and discussions. I want to thank the principals. Well, before we do that, Dr. Weber wants to say something, but I want to thank the principals for being here to share their voice. Dr. Presidio is also up here to answer questions if you have about some of the amazing things. We don't want to take all the time presenting that, but some of the amazing things we're trying to do to bring consistency across the division, because that's one strategy that we need to have in place as we see a large number of students moving from school to school within. Can't always control those moving without and, out leaving our division and going to other parts of the state or to other parts of the world. But if they are moving within our division, we can and must do a lot more, and we are doing some, and we're going to continue to focus on that. So with that, Dr. Berbrand would like to make a comment, and then we are here for questions.
I just want to thank Dr. Duran and the entire team. I think it was a very good presentation. I saw lots of folks taking notes. Just a couple of nuggets I want to share before you ask your questions, and we've still got 40 minutes for lots of good questions back and forth. One, and we're going to do it more and more in the years ahead, we're going to put principals in front of you for back and forth on some of the key issues. I think you need to hear from our school leadership. It's great to hear from system people, but it's even sometimes better to hear from folks straight in the field dealing with the issues. So we're going to continue to do that. The data, we are showing data, these scatter plot data points, more and more, even in the last 6 months. Principals can tell you. Now, there's a lot of sometimes squeamishness when you start to put up a school on a dot. But the reality is we have schools with poverty challenges, EL challenges, mobility challenges, who still score above the line. And looking at the best practices behind that. Now, I know Jesse said in a couple of years, it may not be that way. Jesse is a strong principal. His school performs above the line, and while he's principal, it will continue to do so. He told you some of the nuggets. Tight instructional planning from teachers. Follow the pacing guide that Sloan and his folks have used, and our kids will be successful. But that's its own discipline, and it's not always easily created. Another huge nugget that was shared, the social emotional we need to have. but it doesn't become primary over the academic. It comes in behind it. That's about culture in the school. And it takes a while for school leaders to have to create that culture. I know Tim's talking about 2.5 years in Annandale. I believe that's something that Tim, Lisa, you're still relatively new at your school. Building that culture in. Yes, they have needs that need to be met, but it doesn't become the overall focus and lose the academics. You heard about strategic professional development. Something you heard in science. Science was the most steep curve, but you heard it from Margaret. It's 3 years of content. And if you're a mobile kid, of course it's going to hit you more if you're in and out of places. So how do we better, for science instruction in that 8th grade, really recognize that some kids are really hearing it for the first time? I think that's something we'll have to think about with Francisco and Sloan. Anyway, I really do want you to know that this is helpful for us. Some of these forum topics really are helping us grow as a division, and we look forward to your questions and doing continued work around this topic.
And one last thing, please do look at this resource. It's a great resource for you to see the schools in your magisterial districts and also across. They're ranked in order of mobility. We didn't put them by magisterial district, but this is a valuable document that we hope that will be beneficial to all of you.
Okay, with that, let's go to Q&A and discussion. We have about 40 minutes left, and there are 8 of us. So if you divide 40 by 8, 5 minutes, let's see whether we can stay with that. Before I go to Tammy Delana Colfax, Ms. Evans, Mrs. Strauss, and Corbett Sanders, let me ask you a couple of simple questions. I think Mr. Kraft, you mentioned about one of the things that you considered to be very important was stability of a staff, the retention issue. I'm sure that we can get to that later on when we do Goal 3 presentation as well. But this question was not only to your school, but other 3 schools as well. Do you believe that your school has a sufficient stability of a staff? Yes, no, why, yes, why not, if not?
So I came to Annandale Terrace last October from Westbriar Elementary School, where I was the principal at prior to, and I replaced 56 staff members, instructional staff members, from last year to this year. Which is huge. It's a huge amount of people to, so basically I feel like I've started a new school, but not in a new building. So we're about to go into a renovation and expansion. So having a completely new staff, there are a few staff members this year. There were some people that returned from last year, and they're looking for other opportunities for next year. And it's hard to keep teachers in Title I schools. And I know during the whole interviewing process, because we did open 100% staffed, I was very direct and honest with the teachers that I interviewed, and I told them, this is hard work. This is where you earn your teacher stripes. You can go work in McLean or Vienna. You earn teacher stripes there, but you have a different level of stress. There's a challenge that you have to be up to endure and know that it's great, but it's good. This is the work that changes the world, because these are the children that we're putting out in the world. And if you're up to doing that, come work here. If you don't think this is for you, I completely understand. And I'm not going to think poorly of you as a professional, but I get it. It's not for everybody. So it's hard. And also in thinking about the life cycle of a teacher, I was reflecting actually last night. I started my teaching career at High Bluff Valley Elementary School, and I left and went to Holly after that. And I remember Sherry Chevali, she was a first grade teacher. I was a kindergarten teacher, and she was bitter at me about leaving. And I didn't get it. I'm like, so what? You know, I'm young. It's not a consequence in my mind. I didn't get it. And I thought back to that last night, and she said to me, she said, well, I was Suzinski then. Suzinski, we need people like you. You have to stay. Our kids need teachers to show up every year. They can't get new teachers every year and think that we're going to be any better. I didn't get that. I was 24, 25. I did not get that. I'm a little older than 24 and 25 right now, not that much, but a little. I get it. I get it in the school like mine. I look back at the schools that I've led in at Louise Archer, at Westbriar. The teachers don't leave. They stay. They know the families. They know the history. Our teachers, I mean, it's very mobile. We don't retain teachers. And it's tough, but that's something, a shift that I'm working on to make sure that I'm able to keep the people that are there and keep them built up, but also knowing that the work that they do every day is challenging. It's not for the faint at heart. This is grueling, gut-wrenching work. They have a lot of giving to do, and we ask a lot of our educators, and as school leaders, we have to be mindful of that and keep their cup filled. I'm not a bring the thunder and lightning type of person unless you are hurting a child. If you're hurting a child, gloves are off. I advocate for kids no matter what, and I'm always direct about that with my staff. I do this work for children. I'm a mother. My kids have teachers, and I want their teachers to give it all that they have every day. So I expect the teachers in the school that I lead to give it all that they have every day.
Other principals want to join in?
Sure, I can share because I kind of have a favorite data point every year. And my favorite one this year was that of our 79 classroom teachers, 40% were either new to homes last year or this year. So not quite the numbers that, Lisa saw at Annandale Terrace, but still significant. And there's been, shifts during this year as well. I would also say with that the changes have been the right changes for the building and where we're headed in terms of our vision and our focus on helping kids to be academically successful.
Yeah, we've lost a number of folks at Annandale High School over the last 2.5 years, 2 years. I don't have an exact number, but if I had to guess, it'd probably be around 40 staff members. We've lost folks who want to get closer to home, who live in Prince William or live in Loudoun, and they want to move to a different part of the school system. Listen, it's Lisa mentioned hard work at our last faculty meeting, which was actually before the winter break. I reminded everyone of just how difficult the work is, because if you're looking for an easy way out, or if you're looking just to get a paycheck, number one, you shouldn't be in education in the first place, but number two, you certainly shouldn't be in a high needs school. I found also that some of our instructional focus and some of the expectations around elevating the work of our collaborative teams. I can't speak for elementary or middle, but there seems at the high school level, at least, there seems to be that people always want to run away from the collaborative teams, and there's always another school whose work isn't as elevated as another school, And I came out of the gate last year after my first year, where I just sort of laid low and observed and got to know people. The second year was when we really started to elevate the expectations around the work of the collaborative teams, the frequency with which they're meeting, the work that they have to do in those collaborative teams. Now, we did that, but I also provided instructional support through an instructional coach. We have what's called an instructional support team at Annandale High School. It's a 4-person team that consists of our assessment coach, our school-based instructional technology specialist, our instructional coach, and our literacy coach. And the 4 of them are stand ready to support teachers as we increase the expectations around the work of the collaborative teams. So there's any number of reasons that people have left Annandale. Maybe because the work is getting harder at Annandale, and Annandale has changed over the past. Annandale High School has changed dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years, especially. So the work is becoming harder. Whether I'm setting forth some different expectations or not, I think all I'm trying to do is just put elements of what successful schools have ready and operating to make sure they're meeting the needs of kids. And that's good PD, effective PD, strong work of collaborative teams, clear structures in place, clear vision, mission, and the administrative support to help those things happen. But there's also a tendency to, again, I can only speak for high school teachers sometimes, to try to go where, for example, where collaborative teams, well, they don't do collaborative teams at X school, I'm going to go there, or I'm going to, try to escape the work of collaborative teams. So anyway, that's probably an unfair generalization about high school teachers. So I hesitate to say that, but it's also, I think, sometimes the reality. But as I said before, I'm super proud of the folks who are at Annandale High School now, because as I've seen from day one, they're there because they want to be there. And if they discover that the work's too hard, they don't stick around very long. So we want, like Lisa, we want folks who are there, put kids first.
So this is only my second year at Coates, and we had good stability, I guess, in this short time period. We have an advantage that you can't really control for, in that my school is right on the edge of the county. I mean, we're right by Dulles Airport. A ton of my staff actually live in Loudoun, where they own homes. So I wonder, because I'm so new there, I wonder if this will continue to give me good staff stability that I did not have when I was the principal at Providence. And my staff, many of whom still lived in Loudoun or Prince William or places like that, would drive in, and eventually they'd had to give up on the commute. I have those good conditions, and I think that is a factor with other things, but it's an uncontrollable good factor in my situation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Colfax.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Duran, for helping us better understand the impact of mobility on our schools, and thank you to all the principals who are here today. My question is similar to Mr. Moon, but I'm going to ask you to believe in a fairy tale for a moment, meaning that it is budget season, and imagine if we had unlimited funds. Yes. What could we do to enhance, and maybe your top two answers, are they positions, are they changes? What additional supports could we as a system provide for you if we had, like I said, more funding than we currently do? And I'd like you each to address that. Thank you.
Mind if I go?
Yes.
Okay. So one would be staffing. We have been working very closely with the L team and instructional services to, see what is it that's expected for our English learners. And I don't want to have to choose between planning for growth or providing the right support in math. I don't want to have to choose. I want to be able to provide it all for my students. So that would be one thing, is like, not having to, take risks somewhere else, pull from somewhere else in order to provide the English learners with the staffing that they need. The other thing is that I was having this conversation with Fabio and Jay recently, is, trying to find that right balance between being very focused on our achievement in terms of SOLs and increasing there, but also not sacrificing. We're an IB school. We want to focus on that as well, and we want to be part of the one-to-one initiative. So, we're going to roll out one-to-one for all 8th grade next year, because we want to stay ahead of the curve along with everybody else. We don't want our students to sacrifice in that way, because I've chosen to spend money on staffing. So just kind of not having to make those tough choices.
Those tough choices. Thank you so much.
So my dream, my wish list, so to just keep it at 2, one would be staffing, and it would to be able to have to not have to choose, are we going to purchase a position for resource support for reading and math, or reading and math, not or are we going to provide our students with the technology that they need to make sure that they are being able to experience the work of being a portrait of a graduate? Are they being able to collaborate digitally? Are they being able to have those experiences? Are they being able to have the opportunities to engage in PBLs? I believe in that. I believe in all students having access to as many enriching experiences as possible, because some students need that. In addition to that, My other wish list the reality is, Tim spoke of 80% of his families reporting that English is the second language at home. 90.2% of the families at Annandale Terrace report that English is their second language at home. So our students, they need a lot of saturation on English language development. I know the modified calendar school year was something that was eliminated some time ago. I never personally worked in that setting, but one of the things that is a strong desire of mine is to have that modified calendar for the students at schools like Annandale Terrace with such a high ESOL population, so that during those intersessions, they can exclusively focus on developing English language. Not just during the school year, yes, we have amazing support from our ELS teachers. However, think about the cognitive fatigue there. These children are expected to learn content while they're also expected they're learning a language. So there's two parallel tracks that are going on there that they have to, that they need to learn. If during those intercession periods, they're just focusing on literacy and language development, that would propel those students so that we can increase those graduation rates from Annandale High School, not just, the basic diploma, but increasing those advanced diploma options for those students because they have the potential. So that would be my ultimate dream. Thanks.
I would pay any amount of money in the world for us to have an answer to the attendance problem with our kids. We have got to find ways to, and it begins in the classroom. I'm a strong believer in the single most important element of school operations is having a high quality of instruction in the classroom. Unfortunately, many of our students don't even get to experience that, or don't stick around long enough to experience that, or are late and don't get to experience that in its entirety. But we have got to find a way as a school division to have a system in place to respond to the chronic absenteeism, both excused and unexcused, of our students.
Thank you for the question. That was great. I would wish for two things. One would be to maintain my current levels of staffing through needs-based staffing, through Title I, through Project Momentum, even if Coates does well enough that we're no longer Project Momentum, right? Okay. Because we've leveraged all of these things. Coates, because of its mobility, has an interesting free and reduced lunch rate that kind of spikes up and down throughout the year. Sometimes we're closer to 50%, sometimes we're closer to low 40s, and I think we're probably talked about every year is, could we continue Title I? That's a whole other thing, but my wish would be to continue to have the level of staffing I at least fund through those because it's working out for us. The other thing that I think would help us a great deal instructionally, it's honestly less about money, it's more about time, is continuing the path that I think we're on of building in time on the school calendar where I can actually accomplish good PD with my staff. So like this upcoming calendar with those 3-hour early releases and an expectation for PD, that's a really good thing. It's enough time that I can actually do something meaningful with it. Some of the strategic placement of some of the teacher work days is incredibly helpful. At the beginning of the school year, having extra days built on to actually accomplish some PD. When that time doesn't exist on teacher work days, what I end up doing is paying for substitutes for the entire team to have planning. Right. The teacher's not in front of the kids, and it costs about $100 a head at that meeting to accomplish it out of the school budget. So I am someone who has a real tough time with like teacher-directed work days because I feel like I'm spending extra money to accomplish something very meaningful I could have done on those days. But again, I want to compliment the school board because it looks like a lot of that input into how we utilize time on the calendar to actually accomplish PD for staff on site is a really positive thing, and we will use the time.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your comments, and thank you for the compliment. I mean, we do listen to all of you. Mr. Thompson, I know we are doing something in the SCIP committee specifically on attendance, and we're going to be, Francisco's team is working on that. And I currently have a budget, and it's only for high schools, unfortunately, to my elementary schools, but I do have an amendment that I'm hopeful we will pass that talks about the issue of staffing in our schools. And right now, my amendment sits at for the concentration with the schools with the highest ESOL population. But that was really to get the information out there for people who, because as you said, Mr. Thompson, it oftentimes if you don't, Thomas, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. If you teach in another part of the district, you might not see what is in Annandale. That is true to the district that I represent. And so we often talk about the tale of two Fairfaxes, and we're talking about one of the issues here. It started with mobility, but it's so much more, and mobility is but one factor. So thank you all for your very thoughtful answers. I appreciate, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I have Ms. Evans to be followed by Mrs. Strauss, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, and Mrs. McLaughlin.
Thank you so much for this excellent presentation, and particularly to the principals for being here with us today. This is very powerful information, and this is why I wanted to bring this topic to the board, because this is a conversation that's just starting. The board really has not had this conversation before. We've talked about ESOL, we've talked about free and reduced lunch and poverty, but we've never focused on mobility, and I think it's high time that we did, because it clearly has an impact on your schools and how you need to do staffing, how you need to do planning. It affects so much of what you do. So thank you for the vivid presentation. I do think that it's just the beginning of because we need to take this into account. We need to take mobility into account. We do take FRM into account. We do take ESOL into account. But I have quite a few schools, as you know, that have all three: high FRM, high ESOL, and high mobility. And that's a combination we just need to be cognizant of. So, and I appreciate Ms. Derenak-Kofak's question about what would you do if you had all the money in the world. And I think that's an important conversation to have as well, because staffing needs to stay high. One of the things that I'm concerned about when you look at the membership, and I don't know what slide it's on, but in your presentation, it's clear in the last couple of years we have had that spring increase, and I think that's going to continue. That's something that the schools in Mason District, almost all of them have that spring increase right there. And that's something we need to get used to. And yet at the same time, our staffing reserve is depleted. Already it's depleted. So, if we need to accommodate this, so many of the students are coming in at this point. And so I guess I'd ask, what happened in January? Did you see the same influx in January that you've seen in years past? Lisa, what did you see? Margaret?
Yes, actually. And I know we're talking about Annandale, but this isn't exclusive of our schools, I think. Coming from Westbriar, we saw this as well, because it's the end of the school year in various countries. So that's whenever families move, whether it be job related or whatever. So it's true. I want to say, not last school year, the school year before last, while at Westbriar, we had between returning from winter break and March, we had 21 new student enrollments. And at Annandale Terrace, oh my gosh, we've had, I want to say, since we've returned from winter break, we've had about 20 kids come in. And we've always also seen an influx because of the things that happened with Hurricane Maria.
Right.
We've had a lot of families come in from that as well.
Right. And Mrs. Barnes, did you see this year already?
Well, yes, we have seen an influx. I think we haven't felt it as much because of that staffing that we built in. We built in those extra beginning classes.
Right.
But don't know. I don't have the data to compare the numbers from the past couple of years, but we definitely have had an influx because my DSS is raising caps on classes for ESOL.
Mr. Thomas?
Ours hasn't been as significant as it was 2 years ago. So
Ago was a
last year
big
was
one,
light,
yeah.
and this year so far I believe has been relatively light compared to years past. We use Stewart as a benchmark. We'll sometimes reach out to them and find out what's going on with them, and as a barometer for where we are. But it seems that we're not seeing some of the same jumps in January that Stewart and maybe even Falls Church. I can't.
And you're right. Stewart last year had a full class of ESOL 1s in January, a full class in February, and a full class in March.
Right.
And so that is an extraordinary need that we just need to recognize. And if you look at the chart again, it's not necessarily just January. February, March too. That we have the big influx. And I appreciate what you're saying about needs-based staffing. So I guess I'll throw the question out there. In our needs-based staffing, should we start cranking in something for mobility as well? Yes. Oh, good. Oh, that was quick. And I guess that's something that I would ask as a next step to I don't know how to phrase this, but to think about this, whether there's a way to include mobility as one of the factors in terms of providing more resources for schools. You mentioned several things, staffing. I want to dig a little bit deeper into staffing. Is it primarily just classroom teachers? Is it parent liaisons? Is it psychologists? Is it counselors? Is it all of the above?
Yes.
All of the above. All of the above. Because so many of you, and I think it may be different in different schools, but for the kinds of schools that you have, I think you probably do need, as you mentioned, the trauma counseling as well, because you're not just dealing with people basically moving. They're not just moving, they're moving for a reason, because of homelessness or because, they're refugees or they're reunifying with their parents, and all of those are traumatic events. So I think we need to be thinking consciously and commit ourselves to providing those needed services as well, whether at individual schools. Maybe we need more places that everyone can go at. I don't know the answer to that, but I think we need to be doing more. Tim, yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate those thoughts, Ms. Evans. I would add, I was recently at a meeting with Dr. Zuluaga and other Region 2 leaders. We had an on-time graduation meeting with the principal of the DSS from Annandale, Falls Church, and Stewart. And I made the point that and again, this was framed around on-time graduation, less about mobility, but I made the point that there's work that's being done in schools like Annandale High School, and not just Annandale, but all of our schools, but specifically at the high school level, Annandale, Stewart, Falls Church, for example, doesn't necessarily have to be done at other schools around on-time graduation. The level of intervention and support and time and effort that's put forth just by the directors of student services alone
Right.
is, and again, I can speak from two different experiences. It's night and day. The increase in workload for the directors of student services, the counselors, the social workers, the parent liaisons. We have two outstanding full-time parent liaisons at Annandale High School, and that's not nearly enough. I
think you know how I feel about the parent
Right,
liaisons,
right,
needing to give them more hours. And
yeah, I feel like that's an example of some of the work that's being done, and the depth of the work and the breadth of the work that's being done that isn't necessarily taking place at other schools. And then you combine that with all of the other expectations related to the job, and it can be overwhelming.
absolutely. So I appreciate all the good work that all of you do. If you go to slide 15, speaking of graduation rates, I think you'll see, there is a pretty clear correlation here. Let's look at where the graduation rates are, and I'd say, mobility clearly has an impact there, and we just have to recognize that when we're dealing with, that's tough. When you've got somebody coming in January, February with no English and often no education in their home country, and we're supposed to graduate them, what, in 6 years? Do we have 6 years for that, Tim? Yeah, we have 6 years, but still, you know. So I guess my other question would be, and I don't know if this is for, I guess it is for both the principals and for Dr. Duran.
And Ms. Evans, you think we can give other board members first opportunity?
I do. I'm going to ask your indulgence, though, Mr. Moon. I did bring this topic to the board, and, you know, I think, you know, other board members have a lot of questions, but so do I. I'll wrap up. And my schools also have among the highest mobility, but I will wrap up, Mr. Moon. So do you have recommendations on what we might advocate at the state level in terms of accreditation, as in terms of the GCI? Is there advocacy for that we need to be thinking about at the state level as well?
Yeah, I see on-time graduation really as sort of of two lanes. One consists of the students who are considered dropouts, which become very difficult to track down, and once you track them down, trying to get them back in school is even more difficult. But so that's one lane. The other lane consists of the students who are in school and attending school, whether it be regularly or not, but remain enrolled, but then finding the interventions and staying on top of the students and providing them with another set of eyes, for example, in addition to the teachers and the counselors and the on-time graduation case managers. It's just really becomes a matter of resources. So you throw attendance into the mix and chronic absenteeism being part of accreditation in the future, and it's a challenge. It's also an opportunity, but it'll be a tremendous challenge. I think having conversations at the state level, and I know they've already taken place, but having some conversations, continuing the conversations around how dropouts count into accreditation, or at least reconsidering a definition of a dropout and how we track those students is worth continuing the conversation.
So I guess I would ask that as another next step to consider what kind of advocacy we might have around mobility at the state level in terms of accreditation and GCI. And with that, I'll just make one other point. I've heard from a principal at Westlawn Elementary School who makes a good point about she has a high mobility rate, a high FRM rate, high ESOL rate, and yet she's got classes at 6th grade that have 30 kids in them. And that's tough. And so she's wondering if we can't do something about class size. We have the caps at the K through 2, but or K through 3, I guess. But not 4 through 6. And I think we might want to consider whether or not we should be doing more in terms of lower class sizes in these schools with high FRM, high ESOL, and high mobility. So I'd ask us to consider that as well. And thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. I have a Mr. Strauss to be followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders. Mrs. Strauss.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give just a little bit of a history lesson. In the late 80s, early 90s, we had special needs schools. And it was a static recognition of special needs schools, and it was actually based on mobility and poverty. But at the time, there was the assumption that there was only certain clusters of schools that would have that profile. As the world situations changed and hotspots, particularly in Central America, all of a sudden the mobility factor was moving throughout the county. We had in 2003, 2004, we could see that we had a need to when we would have special needs staffing, it needed to follow the children instead of designated to the school, because that mobility, it was just spreading. But what we had to give up at the time, we were looking at continuing to cap class size in all schools in the primary grades. So, and we had done that in 1st grade. So part of the negotiation was We had to create a staffing model following kids that did not take funding away from anybody at the time. It's fair, otherwise that's a zero-sum game. Very hard to do. We had enough money at the time to create the formula that we now use. It's based on ESOL and poverty and recognized mobility so that the staffing followed the children. But we had to give up on the drive to decrease class size across all schools in first and second grade, and that was what we gave up. But it created the formula that we have now. I want to thank Mr. Kraft for coming to Coates, and actually that whole band of schools across Herndon and across Eldon Street and across where there are Title I schools, it's the same profile that we see in Mason and every place else. Mr. Kraft, what you bring and what you show is that we love all of our children, but it's not just the social, emotional, making sure that they are fed and clothed. It is the academic expectations. And Mr. Thomas, exactly. Not everybody is comfortable with the team taught and the real focus on instructional learning. But we have seen in our models, Dogwood was the first one that showed us. If you really are intentional in what you're doing, because Dogwood pulled themselves up, we can do it, but it's hard. And often you will have sometimes older teachers that love children who've been around for a very long time, but are not comfortable with that very focused, intentional model. But it means hard choices for stability for teachers who come in, who you all are going to bring in, and then your instructional leadership and your principals that really hold the line, and that model works. So Coates has turned around, and it's great. And we have turned around a number of our Herndon schools with the exact same model. Incredible leadership from principals, hiring specifically to bring in teachers who are going to focus on that model. We all love and feel, tenderness for our children, and we feed them and we clothe them and do the other things, but it's that's that academic expectation, the belief that we can get these kids up and over. It's hard work, but this is the model that we choose. And you all have adopted that, and you've shown how well that works. The other piece, we talk about year-round schooling. Oh my, we would have loved to have done that. And money is the root of all evils. We began to run out of money. The 2007 school year, we had to begin to pull back. We had an increase in our funding of 4.5%. That was the first of the pullback of the years, and that was the year we lost year-round schooling. And it's been absolutely like that all along. The years of the 15% increase, the 11% increase in funding, it's gone. And so you all are great poster children for what works. And if we had all the money in the world, we would continue down the road. And our problem is, in other schools, you can't have class sizes over 30 and 31 and 32. And we know we have other needs, so it's a constant battle and a shift. So at any rate, I salute you all. You're doing great work, and you show that it can be done. And if we just had a little more money, we could work even harder. But thank you for sharing. It's a great story. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Strauss. Let me go to Ms. Corbett Sanders to be followed by Mrs. McLaughlin. I know that it is almost 12:30. With your indulgence, we will probably want to spend another at least 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Moon, and I too will try to be brief. I was pleased to bring this topic to the forum with my colleague, Ms. Evans, because this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and one that I believe Ms. Derenak-Koufax's motion shared with Mr. Moon last week on the equity and wraparound services supports much of what you've talked about today. Big concern I have, and I was pleased to hear you reiterate the importance of fidelity of implementation at each of our schools and adherence to that, to our pacing guides and our curriculum. My question is, how do you actually ensure that that happens? Because today, it's not necessarily the case. We have some schools that adhere pretty strictly to it, others that don't. And it's not only, I don't think that it's only focused on the minimum in those pacing guides, but also, and the four core, but the importance of fidelity of implementation for the enrichment piece of our curriculum. And my concern is I'm not sure that we actually have that consistent delivery across the county. Certainly, I don't have it across some of the schools within my district, and so I would like to understand a little bit more from you all. And what I'll do is I'll throw all of my questions out, but that's so that you can hear them and then you can respond so that we're not taking up too much time. Additionally, my concern on that fidelity of implementation is that all of you have been forced, especially at the middle and high school level, to make trades of resources to ensure that we have the supports in place to be successful especially for students that are focused on language acquisition, but at what cost? And so I think that has been somewhat addressed with your response to Ms. Darren at Fairfax, but I appreciate it. If you can add a little bit more detail on that, in particular in the science area, I think that it is very clear that our science outcomes are heavily impacted by the mobility. And so having fidelity is that much more important. And then the last piece on the absenteeism, throw out an idea, but do you think that we actually have to address absenteeism in the SR&R so that when students sign the SR&R, no, in more detail, there's a clearer understanding for parents as well, because oftentimes, especially in the high mobility area, parents have to make trade-offs of, I need care for my children, you're the oldest, you get to stay home and take care of whatever the situation is at home.
So if I could just share a few insights on the first question that you asked, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, in regard to fidelity of implementation. I think sometimes, we take these ideas and we make them a little bit more complicated than they really are. It's a lot of hard work, but I don't know that the answers are really that complicated. It starts with strong leadership, like all of our principals have really demonstrated and shown here today. Principals developing that culture of collaboration in their schools is essential. And we heard that again from all of the folks that are up here with us today. But it takes those targeted instructional leaders in the school to work side by side with the principals and with the teachers to be able to do the work. So that's where you see the schools that are making a lot of progress really have identified and nurtured and developed the instructional leaders in their schools. And those are teacher leaders at the grade levels, yes. They're instructional resource teachers like math specialists and literacy specialists, yes. But the instructional coaching position is so critical. And we don't have instructional coaches in all of our schools yet. You heard Mr. Thomas talk about the impact that that's really had in his school and how he's been able to leverage that position to get those teams to really start to work together in a collaborative and focused and intentional way. So those key instructional leaders are really important. And then the time for us at central office to work with them is critically important as well. So when we have the ability to work with site-based staff in instructional services, make sure that they've got the resources that they need, that they have the training that they need to be successful in working with their teachers, that they have the ongoing coaching support where the central office staff can come out and work with them in their buildings. That's where we're seeing the biggest impact, not just in terms of student test scores, but that's where we see the ability for us to do things beyond just our planning and pacing guides. That's where we see the ability for us to do innovative instruction, technology-infused instruction, project-based learning, performance-based assessment. So it's really that collaborative relationship between the central office staff working with the school-based staff. You need both of those variables to be able to get the implementation, in my opinion.
I appreciate that, but where is the thermometer that gets checked to make sure it's actually happening at each of the schools? Where do you have the process that says, there's not a lot of problem-based learning going on in this school, or, they trade it off because they have a focus and a need in one area, but we no longer have hands-on science in a school.
So I want the principals to be able to answer that question, but a few things I would say that you would look at. Obviously, we look at student performance in schools. That's one indicator. We look at our school improvement planning process to really determine where the areas that the school staff is identifying as needs for improvement. The principals have lots of information from the work that they do with their staff in terms of kind of that qualitative understanding of where staff are in terms of their needs. And we do have opportunities for us to do informal checks and visits with schools as well. And we spent a fair amount of time today talking about English language learners. The mobility problem is much bigger than that, but that is one of our really impacted subgroups, there's no question. And Rich Polio and Karen Kleiber, I know, are here, and they are doing a ton of work working with our schools, not just at the high school level, but at the elementary level as well, to implement our new English language development standards. So we've identified the standards, and central office folks are working, again, side by side with individuals in the schools to work on the implementation. But it takes resources, it takes time for folks to be able to do that. So it's all of those things working together. But those would just be some of my thoughts. But I'd prefer to let our principals wade in here and share some of their perspectives as well.
Can I, just by way of explaining the fidelity of implementation and how we try and get to that, the short answer, I think, to your question on what's the barometer, the administration is basically to ensure that it's getting done and it's getting done well, and so is the instructional coach. But if I could back this up a little bit, we as a system do have, I think, really quality pacing guides. Our curriculum is built and it's full of really great stuff. But it's not a scripted program at all. And FCPS has never been, and it's good that we're not. The downside is that you can't have a teacher wake up on Wednesday and crack the pacing guidance and look for a script and here's what I do today. Like, all of this requires team meetings and unpacking and making sure you can take all the resources in there and shape it into a really great lesson. I think this is where specialists in the building, including instructional coach or reading specialists, if they can help a grade level team manage how to do that, you're going to get stronger fidelity of planning. As far as executing those plans, and it's not just plans sitting on OneNote or something, that really falls on us to make sure that it's going down. But all of those resources are needed in the planning part because it's not an easy pacing guide to just grab and go. But I mean that as a compliment to it. It really wants to establish good practices and not be some textbook-driven thing that we all went through as kids. But it does take that kind of time behind the scenes, and it takes some expertise to ensure that the classroom teachers can get it done really well. As far as some schools implementing with a higher sense of fidelity than others, I think where you find a coach, it's going to be implemented better. I also think that if you are in a school where it is not guaranteed that you're going to be accredited by your SOL scores, there exists more pressure to use what the county has given you. And that's where we work, so I think we can speak that. I think that the pressure might not be as high if that's not such a worry for you, in which case implementation might not be as strong. The other thing that's tough in any school is just time. As I said, no teacher can just pick up our curriculum and just wing it that day. You have to put in the time to unpacking this and establish it, basically turning it into good lessons. We all have, I'm sure, CLT meetings in reading and math every week. But the time to do that in social studies and science at the elementary to give that same amount of time, it's very hard to pull off, because to do so would be to rob classroom teachers of the ability to do other things they need to do to be a teacher. So it's just one of the realities of trying to manage focusing on the most important things and doing them really well, and then maybe not being as tight with some planning of some other things. I hope that makes sense. Okay.
Okay, let me go to Mrs. McLaughlin, to be followed by Ms. Pelchik and Mr. McElveen.
So I know we're pressed for time, so let me first just say, along with what my colleagues have, I very much appreciate all the principals joining us here today and giving us your voice from the front lines. It's really important to us as board members that we do get a chance to hear from you and the challenges you're experiencing and the things that you believe will be helpful to you. So I want to preface that because my remarks are really going to be directed more to Dr. Brabrand, and I don't want what I'm about to say come across as any lack of appreciation for your time here. What we need as a board, certainly what I need as a board member, I think, is not just data, but I need analysis. I need to understand what are going to be the solutions. What's our roadmap? And I'm so grateful my colleagues brought this to the board's attention and that staff who I consider highly talented and capable and probably have a whole lot more knowledge than what was in this PowerPoint. And Francisco, you're correct. This is awesome. I mean, for me as a board member, it's the first thing I can look at to see where my schools are doing. But I'm really struggling with this. While my colleagues were asking questions, and I will confess to all of you, I started doing an internet search, and I found some incredible reports that have been done by various policy think tank centers and other school divisions, national studies. I learned more in looking through that. This one, especially starting from page 11 or slide 11 through 18, as a board member, there's nothing I can pull away from this. If I were asked by my supervisor, John Cook, or anyone in the community, so what are we doing about mobility? They should be able to get that information without necessarily trying to figure it out. Especially slides 11 through 15, when we were showing above and below the line, great charts. But I've said this in prior work sessions, we need the next layer, which is the analysis piece. Why, this is perfect, number 11. Why are we looking at where the ones are above the line versus below the line? What are we doing differently in those schools? And everybody spoke very high level, and again, I understand you can't cram. This could be a whole day session alone. But since it can't be, I would prefer, my next step request is going to be that it's not time sensitive, but as board members, we can't make budget decisions, policy decisions, and to the very thing we talked about, collaborate with our building leaders, our principals, if we just don't understand what this all means, what's getting done. And I think, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, you were trying to capture that. So I do want to go to slide 18. Successes and strategies. If you read that, again, this is a board that we have to understand what every single one of those terms means. You guys all might know what it means, but we don't. And so things like instructional coaches, any of you who've been veterans around for a while and watched budget presentations, Sloan, we've had the conversation. I don't necessarily object to instructional coaches. I still don't necessarily have a clear understanding of how and what it is they do. I heard some of these things. I heard training and coaching, but coaching to do what? Beyond pacing guides, I think that there's more there. The other thing that I read in some of these studies is, and I felt like you were all touching on that, and maybe that's the systemic relationship building, but, and I see Mary Jo Davis in the room here as a fellow social worker, and I know you principals understand this. But the research shows that you're not going to do well in school if you don't feel those connections. And especially with high mobility, it's really hard to feel you're part of a community. So one of the suggestions I read in one of these studies is that you would pair the student with a peer mentor and then a staff mentor. And then they check in not just like once a week, but even sometimes twice a week. And they're looking at things like attendance, behavior, academics, and maybe all of that's going on. But I wouldn't even know that I had to read it through here. And I want to be able to know that's going on. So when my supervisor, the community says, board members, I appreciate that you care about mobility, that it's, the changing demographics in our county, that the challenges and the needs to help every child succeed, we have to know what it actually means. So at a very macro level, I guess I would say that however this was developed, at some point I would want to have seen the white paper behind it. What's driving our solutions? Because this says solutions, but I really honestly can't say I understand what those are. I appreciate the commitment this county has to it, but I think the only way we can as a board of 12, and even to help our supervisors get behind and understand it, is to have a greater sense of what does this framework look like. And I hope I was able to convey, again, my appreciation for the work, but that I feel like I need so much more than what was in the PowerPoint.
And
That's going to be part of the next steps.
And I just want to say thank you, Ms. McLaughlin, for those points. We definitely know that this didn't have all of what you described in terms of the deeper analysis. The initial bringing to the board was the beginning conversation for us. And as I stated, I think twice, we have just begun to even intentionally look at mobility specifically recently in the last couple of years about how its impact has been on our division. And so we are working through the slides 17 and 18, I think you referenced. We are working on those within, and we did not bring those detail here and the suggestions in some of the studies you probably referenced in Google. We certainly have those and can bring those. This initial conversation that was to bring to the board, well, how do we even define mobility in FCPS? Because it's not defined the same way. Even in some of those studies, as we've looked at other divisions, other states, it's defined differently, number one. Number two, then what is an initial snapshot of what it's looking like in terms of our impact? And then the bigger conversation is what are we going to do about it? And what do we need to do about it? And so we are having those conversations. We didn't put those details into this presentation. You're absolutely correct. But it is something that we will and can continue to do as we engage in this conversation. With 1 hour, as you said, this could have taken a day. So our best thinking was within 1 hour, we weren't going to present for an hour even. We wanted time for questions. We wanted to give that bird's eye view perspective of one, the definition and some of the challenges, and then hear from our principals. Not to walk away and say, we're done with mobility, that's it. There's nothing else to address this, but it was a beginning, starting conversation for us. So I certainly, we even toyed with how much do we put in here? How much do we present? How do we present this information given the time that we had to do that? And given the fact that we really, I think Ms. Strauss said this, had not even had this conversation, to our recollection and looking through board docs and whatnot, had this type of a conversation at the board level ever.
Right. Well, and I appreciate you making that point, because we know that student mobility has been a challenge in this county for probably at least a decade. So that's one piece. The second piece is that we have had other presentations to the board deferred, like I think our sexual harassment and assault presentations coming. So I would just say, Dr. Brabrand, I would have been perfectly understanding that if staff needed more time to bring us information, that would have been good. But I will just say this slide, unfortunately, when it says successes and strategies, it leads the reader to think that we actually have strategies, but that PowerPoint doesn't show it. And in the 6 years I've been on the board, we used to get a narrative paper. So there was the PowerPoint, which was just, again, for the public high level, but then the board got a narrative report. And there isn't one for this. And for me, I'm trying to be sensitive to your workload, but I would also assume at some point the division is going to be wanting to have a report on this, because the only way you can all work together on it is that there's a report. So that would be, Mr. Moon, I think, my primary next step.
I know, Superintendent wants to speak very briefly, because that's going to be part of next steps discussion. And I understand that that particular slide was basically hearing from the principals.
Yes.
And we couldn't.
It was.
We didn't have anything more than hearing from principals for this slide. So
That is
Dr.
what
Brand.
that slide was for, voices from the field, to hear just from some of the principals thinking about what the work they were doing with regards to success, not what is our division-wide strategies going to be and what are we going to recommend for that. We wanted to begin the conversation with hearing from them a couple of highlights of things that are working and some challenges that we're hearing. Not to say that was the slide, to say this is now our division's approach to how we become more successful and or address those challenges.
Dr. Brand.
I'll be very quick. I appreciate that. I appreciate that question. Lots of quick nuggets, I would say. One, and this is something I'd like the board to help me with, bringing the problem and better making sure we've defined the problem, or bring the problem and then I've already got the solutions, but we haven't listened to board input about the problem or listening to the field. So that's a little bit of a tension. Here's one thing I can tell you. We've had needs-based staffing since 2003, and we haven't looked at the formula. We need to look at the formula. We haven't looked at EL learners. We haven't looked at mobility. Where do we start our cut point for needs-based staffing? Where does it end? Are there fundamental changes when schools reach certain numbers? Did you hear 80% of Annandale's second language kids either in it or were in it? Our formula doesn't do that, and the formula is 15 years old. We haven't looked at it. So that's one nugget. Was I ready today for that? No, but before this year ends, I will have reviewed it with staff and we'll bring you some ideas around how we can do that. That's one. Two, and you've heard this, but the intentionality, we've got to become intentional about the pacing guide instruction in every school. What we've actually allowed to happen is teachers within our own, we've created a culture. If I don't want that, I can go somewhere else where we don't have to do that here. We need to say there's a Fairfax way where the pacing guide is rich. It's not a junk script. It's good in any school. It's not just good for some schools and others. And I know Chase will get up, and Chase, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and sometimes I am. Our mobility is lower. Our teacher staffing turnover is lower than other divisions in the state and national. But if you look at our intra-transfer and you tag that on, we're actually not lower. I mean, I'll have to have Chase tell me, but that's another nugget. What can we do to build in a culture where we don't have folks come in and then jump after a year or 2 years? You go to a school, you need to stay 3 years, 5 years. Our culture has been, you come into Fairfax and after a year, we got something called transfer, and you can jump on the trolley and go somewhere else up the street. That's been a teacher-centered strategy. Is that a system strategy based on student need? I'm not sure that it is. Something else for this board, for Board of Supervisors, Jesse gave a huge nugget. White coats above the line, one thing he thinks is staffing stability because he has single-family housing. Do we have housing patterns in our school districts that help reinforce a place for our teachers to want to live in the community and not have folks somewhere else? I think that's a much broader one. And then one last thing, fidelity of implementation that another board member asked. Jesse said it falls on the administration. Project Momentum has worked because 5 regional assistant superintendents cannot do justice with 1 or 2 EPs to do fidelity of implementation in 200 schools. Project Momentum's been another layer, and we've gotten results. We've got to figure out how to expand something that's working. Don't have that for you today, but I will before the school year ends.
Thank you. Thank you. I have 2 more board members on my list, Ms. Perchik and Mr. McElvin. Hopefully we get them by 1 o'clock.
Thank you, and thank you. I will be brief. Appreciate your input and comments and research. And I'm someone who does appreciate the process. So while I think we all want answers and want to figure out how to get there, I'm with you, Ms. McLaughlin. I think I also appreciate getting the input early on in the conversation. So I guess I wanted to support when I signed up to speak. It was before Ms. Evans spoke, and I do think we are at a point where we would like to see kind of some of these next steps, data, and maybe drafts of plans of how to address some of these issues. I guess the ones I have listed and would like to hear from the principals, if there's something you feel is missing from this, would be one, and I know Ms. Hines sent out the equity dashboards used in some other districts, but to really start to move forward with our draft of what we see would be an equity dashboard for our district. taking into account from extracurriculars to positions that are needed and other issues around that and outcomes. I guess also I am really interested, and I believe at Westlawn she had 38 students come in and 30 students leave just from October to January. And I know at Jackson, at least 50 students, I believe, have come in every year. So if we could really have staff look at that mobility, the trends at each school in the past, 2 to 3 years, and what would be some ways to try to address that with our staffing formula. So I don't know if, Ms. Evans, you were asking for that plan, but I think we're at the point where it would be useful, at least on the mobility and the level 1 and level 2 student services. What kind of changes should we make to our staffing formulas to account for the fact that many of our schools see students coming and leaving later in the school year, and that's not accounted for. So I hope we can get that soon. I know that's been an issue going on. Chronic absenteeism, I heard that brought up. So, whether to start to get some data on that, and some, ideas for solutions that are used here or elsewhere. At the elementary school, middle school, and high school level, it's going to be different, right, at each level. So at the high school, whether it means some creative programs. I know we've heard from some of looking at more flexibility in the career and college readiness within the high school. So what are some of the solutions that worked that we could start to make some shifts in our system? For chronic absenteeism by age level. For the interest staff, so these are, I guess, areas where I'm seeing that we need a plan. We need data and a plan. I was going to bring up the interest staff, retention and mobility. I hear that quite a bit in my schools. Teachers love it, their heart's in it, but they get burnt out and move to a school where it's going to be a little bit easier. They will be able to have a family, buy a home, and have their own personal life, as well as working for our kids. So getting some more data and maybe some suggestions from staff on a plan on how to start to address that, whether that means time, funding, summer, programs, training, additional support and staff. So what will it look like in coordination with our principals to do that? And finally, when it comes to fidelity of implementation for curriculum and instruction, I know the math curriculum guides were recently updated. I know we have excellent staff working on science at the elementary school right now. What have we seen for fidelity since the new pacing guides have been brought in? And it's wonderful work that your staff is doing, Sloan, but then what does that mean at the school level, at the planning, the implementation, and are there suggestions from the school side, right, of how we can help them implement that better? But I think that's something we've been hearing about for a few years and want to address is fidelity of implementation. And, as a teacher, knowing that you're trained and have the time to do that, I really appreciate you saying that. So how does that impact our calendar? I'm very happy to hear you say we started a calendar committee that's helped a little bit this year. And as we look at future calendars, what is the impact and how can we ensure we do that? So I guess I'm at the point where those are the ones I saw that we need some more data and start to get drafts of plans from staff that we can look at. And I don't know from our principals if there's something that was left out. I know I had to step out briefly that we should really start to address at the countywide level. I don't know. Sounds good. Okay. Well, thank you so much again, and we are very fortunate to have your work and input here today.
Thank you. Mr. McLebin.
And I'll get us out. Just a request for the Braeburn briefing that something that Principal Pilson brought up was the influx of students from Maria. I would like the data on Maria and Harvey refugees. Thank you.
In Puerto Rico.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to next steps. Could you put up the screen? And for those in the audience who are here for 1 o'clock, Goal 3 presentation discussion, we're not going to be able to start that until, at least not until 130 or 140 time frame. Is that the whole thing? Is it everything in the one screen? Oh. Okay, on this page, I want board members to just all read, and then we'll go one by one. Read first, whole thing first. Okay, could you go to the next screen so that we can continue reading? Okay, let's go back to the first page at the top. Ms. Evans, does that capture what you're asking for? Oh, it does. Okay, with a show of hand, if you could support this next step, raise your hand. Okay, there we go. The second bullet, Ms. Evans again.
So help me out here. Is mobility the right word there? I mean, it's really the influx of enrollment. So I'll ask the principals, does that capture what we need to capture, or do we want to say an increase in enrollment? Is that
Anticipated increase in enrollment. I think there are two increases.
not really? I mean, yeah. Does that better capture it? What you're saying? Does that better capture what we're, rather than mobility, what we're really talking about is a burst in enrollment? Okay. That's, I think, better captures it. Or Ms.
Well,
Dearna Kovacs?
Yeah, I have a question. So I think when you say prepare, are you saying setting funding aside, or what?
My concern, the context of this was my concern over the depletion of the staffing reserve.
Right.
So
resources are available. Yeah, I think we need to talk about resources, because if you talk just
I'm fine
about
with putting it that way.
Okay.
So what ensure resources are available
yes.
for anticipate. Yeah, I think that's better. Okay.
Okay. As an extra step, if you want to support this, raise your hand. All right, thank you. Third one is again Ms. Evans.
Ms. Corbett-Sanders suggests at the state and federal level. I'm fine with adding that.
Okay. Okay, those in support, raise your hand. Fourth, Ms. McLaughlin, does that capture? Okay. Okay. If it does, we're not going to do wordsmithing here. Then those in support, raise your hand. Number 5, fifth bullet. Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
I'm going to suggest that Ms. Palchik and my bullets get combined so that we're more focused.
So you want to wait until we get to that point then?
No, I would just take hers, bring it up to mine.
Okay.
And I support that.
And then, yeah, so basically look at the data we have and then make sure that we're using best practices.
So could you give the full sentence?
So what I would do is analyze the current data on fidelity of implementation of the new pacing guides. in terms of student success across the county. And then ensure we are using best practices to accomplish. Fidelity across the core four and beyond. And then you can take out the rest. Does that work?
Yeah, as long as that.
Oh, and include suggestions for improvement.
Right, okay. Right, just to ensure whether that means timing, professional development,
Resources.
instructional coaching, resources.
Right.
Okay.
And maybe not use the term suffered, but have what programs' outcomes have been impacted as a result of resources being reallocated to it.
I thought we were still looking at that. Analyze current data. Where are you?
To the next one.
Okay. Maybe we should go next one after seeing whether we have enough hands for this one. Okay. We'll go to the next one then, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. So we took out suffered from somewhere.
Yeah, you could say negatively impacted, but the concern here is that we have a bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul in some of our schools. Okay. And so I want to make sure.
This is just asking questions, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right, those in favor of this question being asked. Okay, and then we'll go to the next one by, again, Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
And this one is just a suggestion that because of the concerns over chronic absenteeism and parents not really being fully aware of the impact of their students not being in class, but parents and students having to sign the SR&R, it might be helpful to have a little more detail.
Okay. Those supporting that as the next step? I want to see enough hands. Okay. We'll go to the next one. Mrs. McLaughlin, the next one is yours.
Might I ask, Ms. McLaughlin, if this isn't maybe duplicative of the one above that asks for the analysis and information on our current work?
You mean the analyze the current data of fidelity? Which one?
Well, I just asked the question because, I mean, we can always give more narrative information, obviously, to accompany slides. But typically, like you had referenced, sometimes we have these narrative reports that are associated with the presentations. Those are typically when we've had like a program evaluation done on something, if there's an attached report. So I was just trying to get at, it seemed like you wanted more narrative information about kind of what's our existing state and what are some strategies maybe for moving forward, which is a little bit different than a report. That's why I raised the question. But it looks like Dr. Brabrand has.
So, Megan, I was thinking more solution-oriented. You wanted the solutions. You know, you feel like we explained, but we didn't have the solutions. I don't know what the old narrative report is. Can we just say report with division-wide approach to solutions to address the challenges presented in the presentation? And
you can say provide a report. Okay. But it needs to be something other than a slide presentation.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
You know,
Hey.
Okay, more narrative explanation of the slides presented today. You want?
No, not at all. Like that's the top one. This one's more of, as was explained to all of us, this was a first. Looking at
Right.
in terms of what we're doing in some of our schools, how are we going to provide, additional solutions? What are the
I mean, I would love to be able to schedule another follow-up work session and then have really discuss about division-wide approach or potential solutions to address the challenges we have.
Yeah, I guess I would say that to me.
Okay.
Presentation on where we are as
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
Mr. Moon, whether here, and I think it's sort of included in here, we probably need to specify that we're asking for recommendations, because I don't see, I mean, I think it's clear that we're asking for recommendations, but.
I would suggest the wording on our one pager, number 4, the next steps. That's what we wanted to do, next steps. So, I mean, maybe we can use those words, which is for us to identify strategies and resources that are currently in place and those that need to be further developed. So that was our intent of the next steps. If you see on the one pager on the bottom, would that capture what you're asking for, Ms. McLaughlin?
At the bottom. At
It's
the very
number
bottom.
4, the next steps, action needed. This is what our intention was after today, was to look at what was currently in place and then also recommendations, things that may need to be further developed. So does that kind of capture what you're asking for here? That was our thinking of the next step, our own next step that we put out there.
Okay, so let's then use that language in lieu of Mrs. McLaughlin's up there. And substitute with that. With that, understand you all have that language on the one pager at the bottom. Would you support that as the next step? Here, raise your hand. I want to see hands, whether there's enough. Thank you. And we will go to the next one. Ms. Pelchik. Transient mobility reached school in past 2-3 years.
Yeah, can we combine that with Ms. Evans or?
Ms. Evans.
Perhaps, up top.
Are you okay with that? Yeah.
I am. I think that makes sense to have that be one of the things we look at, the formula.
Yeah, in
Higher
5 years. I was just throwing out 2 to 3 years.
So where does that go to?
The past 5
Ms.
years.
Pelchik, where does that go
I can't see
to?
it. It's at the top.
So could you move?
I think.
Such as the staffing formula, perhaps? Just
Sure. I mean, it's also tied to the second one is the anticipated increase is what we're looking at
okay.
for mobility.
Follow on to it. It makes
So providing more resources for schools.
I like having all mobility in one. So if we're open to combining them into one mobility-centered next step with sub-bullets,
I'm not sure what's happening here.
Do you mind pasting it so I can, oh, there it is, thank you.
Or could we just leave where it is as a separate bullet?
Okay, that's fine. Change
Okay.
it to 5 years.
Let's go back down and then put it back where it is.
Why, no, what, can we group them together? Is that okay?
I don't know where that goes. Ms. Pelchik, you need to give me direction.
I can't hear you both at the same time, sorry. It's in both, okay. Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to leave it with the other mobility questions. I just find it useful, and if
Okay.
the board members are open to making it
Thank you
5 years.
so much, Ms. Barnes and Ms. Person.
Our principals have to leave. They have to get
Okay.
back to school.
Ms.
so
Thomas and Mr.
We thank
Kraft
them, but
as
I'm
well.
letting them to get back. Sorry.
Could we change it to 5 years? Thank you.
That will do?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, board members, I want board members to stay here. Okay. Would you support that, changing it to 5 years? Raise your hand. If I don't see the hands, we're not changing it. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go back down. That's done. And then the one last one is from...
Oh, there are two more.
Okay, two more. Provide the data on chronic absenteeism. Okay? All right, raise your hand. The last one from Mr. McElveen.
I think, yes.
Okay.
So, Mr. Moon,
Support, raise your hand, please. Yes. Ms. Evans.
I did have one other suggestion that didn't get captured about reviewing the issue of class sizes at the upper grade levels at elementary schools.
Do you think we can do that when we do goal 3? We'll be talking about class size today.
Well, this has to do specifically with mobility, though. It has to do with looking at the high mobility schools and looking, I mean, I could do it at both.
Yeah, if we could wait until that, because we can do that at the time.
All right.
We'll see. Okay, with that, I'm going to call this portion of the work session adjourned and take a 30-minute lunch break and come back 1:45.